Hello students. This week we'll be talking about Southeast Asia. So we are just to the east of South Asia, which is India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and the rest, and to the south of China and Tibet. So we'll talk about China, Japan, and the Koreas next week. So this area just to the south. So basically the last little bit of the Eurasian continent, as well as our island countries. Let's talk about the subregions of Southeast Asia. The main part that is connected to the Eurasian continent is the mainland or the peninsular region. That includes, as the map shows, Burma, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. Our island or insular region includes all of our islands, including the Philippines, Brunei, Singapore, and Indonesia. There's a little closer view of our mainland or peninsular region. And then our insular or island regions. As you can see, some of these are very unique in their shapes. And we'll talk about why that becomes a challenge later on. So first, let's discuss the environment and the landscapes of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is unique because there are multiple different types of environments and landscapes, including the highlands. So this area is on plate boundaries, and we're going to discuss that in just a minute. Due to the fact that it's on an active plate boundaries, we have mountain building that occurs. So in some areas of Southeast Asia, we have high mountains, including some that lie at 10,000 feet. So this is in Burma or Myanmar. Also in Southeast Asia, we find very low-lying islands, including the Philippines. Throughout the mainland or the peninsular region, we have one major river, and as we have done in previous sections, you need to know what the major river is. Here, it is the Mekong River. It is Southeast Asia's longest waterway. It originates in the Tibetan Plateau, which we will discuss next week when we talk about East Asia, and travels 400 kilometers to emerge into the South China Sea, as you can see on the map. When it emerges into the South China Sea, it forms the Mekong Delta. Just as we discussed in South Asia, the Brahmaputra rivers and the Ganges rivers that create that delta, there is a delta at the Mekong River. And the Mekong River Delta, one of the most biologically productive areas of the world. So why is the Mekong so important? Why do we focus so much on rivers at all? Is because of water. Water hugely important for the peoples of any area, but in particular this area. Our Mekong is our major river system. So it is the source of water, irrigation, and areas to fish for 65 million people. At the upper Mekong, so this is in the peninsular region again, rice has been grown for centuries in terraced hillsides. So you can see that in the image there. Those are terraces. We discussed that before, where humans have cut little steps into the sides of any hilly area to help create little flat places to grow rice. As I said, it is a very biologically diverse area, and the Mekong is the second most biologically diverse river in the world, following the Amazon. There are more than 800 species of freshwater fish that are found in the Mekong River. The Mekong River Commission, which is a joint exploration of these countries, so Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, was formed in order to protect the river. So we talked about the upper Mekong being an area for rice planting. The lower Mekong is also an area we have large areas for rice, but it's a different type of rice planting, which includes rice paddies. When you watch Good Morning Vietnam, you'll see images of that in the film, as well as in this image in the upper right. That is people farming in a rice paddy. Again, where are they going to mainly do that is in the area of that, actually the delta. Or in the area in Vietnam. So that delta area, highly fertile, perfect for wet rice cultivation. So as you might imagine then, Vietnam, second largest exporter of rice globally, as well as an area where we see a lot of fish and shellfish exporting. So here's an image of settlement along the Mekong. Oftentimes people in the Mekong River spend their entire lives or most of their lives on the water. They actually have little houseboats, basically as you see in that image in the upper right. So they never leave the water or very rarely go on to land to get just basic necessities and spend the rest of the time on the water. So they will build these fish traps. I think people have them in boats here as well. They're live fish wells. And they'll have that on their boats, so they'll basically feed the fish on the boat and, you know, have a little stock of fish. All right, so volcanoes. Let's watch a short video about volcanoes. So that is volcanoes in Southeast Asia, and they are a very important part of the landscape in Southeast Asia. As you saw in the video, they are pretty well present all over that area, and of course still part of that ring of fire, as we've discussed previously. Again, that is lying along the Pacific plate boundaries, so this is Southeast Asia, that area in particular. So our Philippines and Indonesia, part of that. And this is where we get our higher highland areas, the active volcanoes, the trenches that we're going to see. All of that is because we're in a geologically active area. So in Indonesia, we had a volcanic eruption that occurred in October 2010. Around 194 people were killed as a result of that volcanic eruption. There's some images of that. So, as we've discussed before, one question that scientists ask themselves is, why would people live in an area where there is all of these geologic hazards? Why do people want to live in areas near volcanoes? If you said because the volcanic ash makes the fertile soil, you are absolutely correct. If you recall that the volcanic ash is able to be, or any ash in general, is able to be mixed into the soil, and that increases the fertility of the soil. So people will live near volcanoes because then they can have soil that is a little bit more fertile. Most tropical soils are sandy and relatively poor for growing food. And this is a quote from NPR after that earthquake in 2010, or a volcanic eruption, excuse me. And as it says, it ruined my fruit crop, but then I won't need fertilizer. So beyond the aesthetics of a very pretty area of the world, it also provides fertilizer. This area is also prone to tsunamis. Let's see if that graphic's going to work. I don't know if it is. Tsunamis, what is that? Well, this occurs when an earthquake under the water, a volcanic eruption, typically under the water, an underwater landslide, creates a series of waves. Those waves in the deep ocean are relatively shallow, but as they reach the shoreline, they increase in height. So you can actually see that in the image in the lower left. The waves will actually go up rather than cresting and breaking, so they become a wall of water. And when they hit the land surface, that's when they break. These can be massive. As it says in the slide, in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, it killed 225,000 people. So there is an image of that. Oh, good, my graphic's working on the slide. If you can see in the lower left, that was the impact, and that red rippling out is the energy from that earthquake. So an underwater earthquake was triggered, and that released all of that energy. And I believe it said that it was about as much as 23,000 Hiroshima-type atomic bombs. And where that hit then, as you see in the upper left, is massive destruction. So basically taking out everything but the most sturdy homes. So on our map, you can see those areas that were both affected and heavily affected. And by heavily affected, we mean loss of life. So in Indonesia, where the epicenter was, we can see that there were 167 plus estimated deaths with 500,000 people missing. And the problem with tsunamis is when they move onto the land, of course, is like a regular wave, but it also draws back. So when that wave is drawing back into the water, it's pulling everything in its wake. When we have settlement that's near the volcanoes and the rivers, there is excellent farming, animal husbandry, so people can have their animals, or of course the fishing, as I mentioned before. However, if you're in areas that are not near those formations, the soil is actually shallow. So beneath our soil is limestone, just as we've discussed in areas of Florida. So thinking about Miami, where the soil is relatively shallow, if you dig down roughly half a meter, you will hit limestone bedrock. That means that the roots of plants can't dig down very deeply. So what that means for our farmers is that they depend on the existing vegetation to stay fertile. If the vegetation is taken away, then the soil will become heavily eroded and might even become desert. What is the climate of Southeast Asia? In our island or insular region, it is primarily tropical wet with no dry season. As you can see, there's parts where we have the highlands, but predominantly this area is very wet. In our mainland or peninsular region, you can see Burma is a monsoon climate along with the Philippines. Cambodia, Laos, and parts of Vietnam are a tropical savanna, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And in the north, as you go into China, we hit humid subtropical. This area is also prone to the monsoon winds that we saw in India. But the monsoon winds here are wet in both the winter and the summer. As you can see, the red arrows are our summer monsoon. They're passing over the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. It's wet. In the winter, which is our blue arrows, they're passing over the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. It is wet regardless of the time of the year. If you can see the black lines that lie along our island area or the insular region, it is between the borders of our intertropical convergence zone. So this area is just going to always stay wet. So what type of plant cover do we mostly see in areas that are near the equator? If you said tropical rainforest, you are absolutely correct. So there's another image showing you the rainfall. So again, in our insular or island area, we have 0 dry months, or maybe a little bit of dry months, 1 to 4 dry months. On the mainland or the peninsular region, you'll have, as we do in most of Florida, half a year might be dry. So in those areas where there's very wet and warm all the time, what does that mean? Well, it can be good. It provides relief from the heat, as it is very hot, as well as watering our crops. And since rice is dependent on water, it's perfect for that. So these are houses. It's the same house. And in the winter, when it gets dry, you can walk up to your house and then climb up to the door with a ladder. But in the summer, when it is really wet, you need to take a canoe to the door. And that leads us to the bad parts of our monsoon climate. Obviously, flooding is an issue. If you're going to have very heavy rains, as we saw in India, it can lead to flooding, especially in areas that are very steep or, lacking in any kind of tree cover. And we'll talk about the fact that this area has become heavily deforested. Also means this area is really prone to molds and fungus, which doesn't necessarily seem like it would be a big deal, except if any of you have, in your parents' home or in your own home, have had to deal with mold. Mold is a really serious problem. It can get into your lungs and cause numerous upper respiratory infections. You can also get fungus on your body. So if any of you have ever had athlete's foot, that is fungus. You can get fungus on your toes. This is where we get a lot of skin infections in this area of the world. So some of our environmental history of the region. Our ecosystems include that dense forest that originally covered most of the area. As I said before, this area actually pretty well deforested as a result of human actions. So you'll get evergreen trees because this is an area that doesn't really experience any cold, dry months or very few. Our evergreen trees will keep their leaves. Our tropical deciduous trees drop their leaves. And the tropical savanna, very similar to what we saw in sub-Saharan Africa. So very dry periods, and they'll have wet periods as well. Along our coastline, we'll have mangroves, just as we see here in South Florida. Just as we see in South Florida as well, This area means it's really great for fishing. It's good for the baby animals that like shrimp or other baby fish, and they can hide out in the mangrove roots. So in the past, we had numerous scientists that came to the area and made observations of what was going on. So one of those scientists was a biologist by the name of Wallace. Wallace was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. How many of you have heard of Charles Darwin? Probably most of you. So he made actually similar observations to Darwin. As a matter of fact, Darwin in his lifetime tried to give Wallace credit for also discovering the mechanism of evolution, which is natural selection. But people remember Darwin's name and not Wallace's. For a variety of reasons, Darwin was wealthy, among other things. Well, one of the things that Wallace observed was this kind of distinct boundary between plants and animals in one area of Southeast Asia and then plants and animals in another part. And he called this dividing line Wallace's line. And you can actually see that there on the map. So to the northwest of the line, you can see the forest types include rainforest, monsoon forest, other types of secondary forests. And to the south of that is still primarily rainforest. So this line divides two biogeographical zones. In the northwest, we find large land mammals like tigers, elephants, and orangutans. And to the southeast, we find marsupials. So how do scientists think that this happened, or how did Wallace hypothesize that this happened? And I'll show you on one of our maps that has relief, but the South China Sea is actually really shallow. So Wallace hypothesized that in a time period where we had lower sea levels, the South China Sea was actually exposed, which allowed larger animals to travel, moving north into the mainland, or possibly south into the islands, but they didn't travel too far. Other smaller animals might have made a longer journey, which is why we think that when the sea levels rose, those smaller animals like marsupials were isolated on the islands. The marsupials also making their way down into the Pacific Islands, Australia, and New Zealand. So things like kangaroos, as you see in the image on the screen. So human use of the environment. This area is unique by the extensive adaptations that people have done to their rather unique environment. As I said before, rice, one of the most important crops for Southeast Asia. It's the basis of their diet. Rice also has the largest effect on the environment because humans so heavily modify the landscape in order to cultivate it. As I said before, there's a couple different ways that you can grow rice, including rice paddy terracing, as you see in the image. Because this area is so heavily wet all the time, it is really perfect for wet rice cultivation because we get a lot of standing water. As we said before, our rice terraces cut into the side of mountains, gives us a level surface to plant our rice, reduce erosion, and also facilitate water control. Just like I talked about in South Asia, if the area is just a smooth side or doesn't have those little steps cut into it, the water can just whoosh down the side like a water slide. But if you have these steps cut in it, it's going to slow the water down, which controls the flow of the water. It'll also control water coming from the Mekong or other rivers because it helps prevent them from breaking their banks and flooding. People have been doing this type of adaptation to the environment for thousands of years. Actually, this area, along with East Asia, is the masters of water control, and they kind of have to be given how much water they deal with. Water, of course, will help maintain the soil fertility And actually creating these rice terraces helps to do that as well because we have reduced erosion. Rice farming is actually quite labor intensive, as you might imagine if you spend all day bending over in a wet area picking rice. So what does rice farming require? Well, first you have to prepare and maintain the fields, especially of course if you're doing rice terracing, if your area is not already done so, you're going to have to cut the terraces into the side of the mountain and then till the field, get it ready to plant. Then of course you'll transplant the seedlings. As you go further along in the season, this will require weeding and protecting from other pests, and then finally harvesting the rice. Who is going to perform the bulk of this work? Well, as we see in many areas of the world, it will be women. So what are some of the challenges in terms of environment that this area faces? Well, the physical geography of this area actually creates some of those challenges. The countries of Southeast Asia are fragmented, elongated, and rugged. So if you can see in the map, these are actually particular terms that we use in geography. So an elongated country might be something like Vietnam. Well, in some parts of the country, it may only be a few miles wide. If you've ever been down to the Keys and you've been on the main road, it's basically not even a mile wide, right? It's tiny. So Vietnam is very much like that. Our main cities are at the two ends. So trying to administer government in this area, pretty difficult. Thailand is protruded, so it's got the main concentration of the land, but with this kind of random bit sticking out the bottom. The Philippines, fragmented. Indonesia, fragmented, right? Cambodia itself is compact, right? So actually that's one of the better areas in terms of administration of government. So that creates challenges in terms of integration, transportation, and economic development because you have countries that are hard to administer to. What is helping to create that fractured physical geography? Again, are active plate boundaries. So here in this map, you can actually see that. And this is also where you can see that South China Sea, how shallow that is. So during the last glacial period, the Sunda Shelf, which is in the center of our Southeast Asian region, was exposed. So that white area, or kind of like light blue, is actually the edge of the Eurasian continental plate. So the ocean is shallow there. But if you can see those purple lines with the arrows, those are plate boundaries. And along our active plate boundaries, especially with oceanic boundaries, you'll get the creation of island change, like archipelagos. So archipelagos are island change, just like Indonesia. All along the edge of Indonesia are active volcanoes. There's also an area where we have extreme earthquake hazards. In the Philippines, pretty much the entire country is extreme earthquake hazard area. So this area full of challenges, not only the shape. This area, as I said before, also very rugged. Because it is active plate boundaries, it has active physical geography going on. As you can see all along that edge, we have mountain areas, mountains here, right? Those are our highland areas. We also get the formation of trenches. So our Mariana Trench, which is over here where we have the junction of our Philippine plate and the Pacific plate, creates the Mariana Trench, the deepest trench in the world, but other trenches as well. And again, this is where one plate is subducting or going under the other plate. And there'll be unique things in these trenches that you wouldn't find anywhere else. So here's an oblique view of the Mariana Trench. As I said before, located between the Pacific and the Philippine plates, and it is the deepest trench in the world at 36,201 feet. And to give you that comparison, Mount Everest is 29,029 feet. So it is deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Remember, that's our tallest mountain in the world. So there have been some scientific explorations to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, but we really don't know that much about it. We had to send basically unmanned rovers down there. As I said before, the bedrock of this area is limestone. So limestone areas create karst topography. As I talked about when we talked about the United States, this is the same type of thing we see in Florida. So karst topography means that you're going to get the possibility of sinkholes, or in this case, subterranean caves. What's going on here? In our rainwater, we will have a very mild carbonic acid. As it says, carbon dioxide is dissolving into the water and it makes it very mildly acidic. Typically not going to hurt you. I mean, it will hurt buildings, and obviously, as you can see, it will eat away at the rock. But it's not going to happen overnight. That's something that occurs over long periods of time because the acid in there is very weak. But over time, because it is limestone, limestone is porous, there's cracks in it, it allows that weak, very weakly acidic water to move down into the bedrock. So as you can see in the image, over time that might create a area where water will go under the ground, right? That acidic rock will keep eating away at the acidic water, will keep eating away at the rock and eventually create caves. So those are subterranean, meaning below the surface of the ground, until it reaches, as it says here, a volcanic and sedimentary rock layer, which is impermeable, or it doesn't allow water to come through it. So as you can see in the image, that stream that disappears underground will eventually emerge on the other side of the mountain. In Southeast Asia, it creates these karst towers or limestone towers. They're very similar to towers that you can find in Miami if you're driving around Miami. So you're not something that you're not familiar with, maybe, but because of differential erosion, so different erosion patterns, that same thing with our mildly acidic rainwater and wind and sand creates those very interesting lumps of limestone. And as I said before, our weakly acidic rainwater is making its way underground and creating caves. We do have caves here in Florida as well, in the Bay of Biscayne. So it's not just that we have them or we don't have them like Southeast Asia, we do. So what happens as a result of all of that erosion, of all of our acidic rainwater? Well, that actually causes the formations of things we see in caves called stalactite and stalagmite. So what are these things? This is actually the erosion of calcium out of the limestone. As that weakly acidic rainwater is dripping into the cave, it's basically leaching out the calcium. That calcium drips off of the roof of the cave onto the ground. So a stalagmite is rising mightily from the floor of the cave. Our stalactites are clinging tightly to the ceiling of the cave. They're basically forming exactly like ice crystals, the icicles like you'd see up north. So if you can visualize that, or if you're from that area, you'll know. It's the same type of formation, but it's the erosion of limestone, that calcium leaching out of those. And my graphic's not working, sorry guys. All right, that is the physical geography of Southeast Asia. So if you want to, you can pause here. Otherwise, you can keep going for the people of Southeast Asia. Let's talk about the people of Southeast Asia. So as I said previously, the South China Sea is rather shallow. During the last ice age, the last glacial period, that shelf, the Sunda Shelf, was exposed, which allowed people and animals to cross from the mainland on the last little southeastern bit of the Eurasian continent and down into the islands. So as it says on the slide, people from that mainland area reached the Southeast Asian islands from Eurasia about 60,000 years ago. They kept on going all the way down. So these are the people who populated Australia, the Pacific Islands, as well as New Guinea, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., etc. So basically all of this area, those people migrated down from Southeast Asia. How do we know that? Well, genetic studies as well as language studies. So we can study the language patterns of the people who live in this region as well as the people who live in Southeast Asia, and that tells us that they were at one point related to one another. Primarily, they were hunter-gatherers, as we've seen in other parts of the world, but over time, once again, we see the agricultural revolution. So this occurs about 8,000 years ago. At the agricultural revolution, this is when people start domesticating plants and animals. So in this area, it would have been water buffalo, dogs, things of that nature, but also rice. So people cultivated rice from a grass that had edible seeds roughly 5,000 years ago. So a really short video about the history of rice, or a story about rice growing, I should say. So did you imagine that rice was so labor intensive? I bet you probably didn't realize how much it took to get rice from the field to your plate. Just imagine being the one that had to stomp on all of the stalks to get the rice out. So as I said previously, it's a lot of work to get rice. It is labor intensive and mostly done by women. So in Southeast Asia, the most prevalent type of rice are the paddies. A lot of those are the lower lying ones. Terracing, of course, in the highland area. So there's more images of that. So there's our terraces, there's our paddy farming, more terraces. Previously in South Asia, I talked about the Green Revolution. The same thing happens in Southeast Asia. People were worried about the explosion of population that we see in the region, and so decided we needed to have increased crop yield, and it was particular to rice. South Asia and Southeast Asia both focused on rice. So again, what that involved was the increased use of chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and chemical herbicides. So this is our kilograms of rice per hectare of land. And that starts in 1961 and goes to 2005. So as you can see, pretty much all our areas saw a huge increase in the production of rice. So the Green Revolution was successful in terms of increasing our output of product. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, that what happens is it becomes an arms race. So the continuous use of chemical pesticides, chemical herbicides, and chemical fertilizers creates this need where you have to continuously apply them. The land itself cannot do the job anymore. It can't protect from pests. It can't produce as much because we've stripped all the nutrients from the soil. So now we have to use our chemicals. The other problem that we see in the use of our fertilizers is we will often get things like blue baby syndrome. So blue baby syndrome is where nitrites are bonding to the hemoglobin in the blood. Where do we get nitrites? Well, that's coming from nitrates, which are, guess what, a fertilizer. So when you have these very heavily fertilized areas of the world, like in our farms, the wastewater runs off of that and it goes into the drinking water. And as you know, in a lot of areas, we do not have any kind of treatment for our water. So people will drink the water. It is laden with the nitrates. In the human body, it becomes nitrite, and it bonds with the hemoglobin and replaces oxygen in the cells. In infants, this will cause the infants to look blue, which is why we have blue baby syndrome, and it ends up killing them. All right, so that is our very early history. It was mainly centered around rice. People were domesticating animals like water buffalo. This area actually has European colonization a little bit later than some of our other areas of the world. Kind of like when we talked about the Pacific Islands, it was a little bit remote. People didn't care, you know, they saw it and were like, this is nothing important. But as they moved forward in time, started realizing there were valuable things that they wanted there, including rice, tea, and rubber. So in the mercantile period, earliest explorers to this area were the Portuguese and the Spanish. And as we talked about when we talked about the Pacific Islands, they were mainly traveling. They might have stopped off and used the area for getting supplies, but mainly didn't colonize that area at first. So when we call it the mercantile period, it was they were looking for trade. And the main group that ended up settling in the area, or colonizing it, I should say, was the Dutch. So as we talked about in South Asia, we had the British East India Company. Here in Southeast Asia, we had the Dutch East Indies, and that was what eventually becomes known as Indonesia. The Dutch were a little bit different than some of our other colonizers, which is why some countries were okay with them coming in. At least at first, they were mainly focused on, again, trade. They really wanted stuff. They didn't really care about forcing people to practice their religion or speak their language. Over time, they became a little more forceful about that. And then in the industrial period, other countries got involved. So France, Britain, and the United States also took colonial holdings, including in the Philippines. So the Philippines were a Spanish and a U.S. possession, which we'll talk about some of the effects of having been colonies of those two countries. What eventually becomes known as Vietnam was a French colony. And as I said before, the bulk of Indonesia was a Dutch colony. So that colonial influence is visible in both the language that people speak and the religion that they practice. So the bulk of our area for Southeast Asia is either some type of Buddhist or Islamic. However, in the Philippines, most people practice Christianity. This is, again, a reflection of having been both a Spanish and a U.S. colony, where Christianity is the dominant religion. Also, many people in the Philippines at least speak Spanish as a second language, if not their first language. This also affects the landscape that we see here. So this is a fort in the Philippines, and it was clearly a Spanish fort. So if any of you have ever been to St. Augustine in Florida, you'll see similar things, Spanish-style forts. Also see 1950s era U.S. military bases. So Clark Air Force Base, as you see, that's also in the Philippines, and very clearly a 50s style base. So again, that colonial influence of having been a Spanish and U.S. colony, is evident in the religion and the language of the people. All right, so these areas were colonial holdings. And eventually, they gained their independence from being European colonies. However, prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II, the Japanese began a campaign of Pacific expansion. So they call this Asia for Asians, or United Pacific. And as you can see, they actually took over large swaths of this region. So they expand into China, into pretty much all of our Southeast Asian islands, and also try to go into the Pacific Islands. This, of course, ends when our Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. This propels the United States into World War II and eventually leads to us bombing Japan, and we sign a treaty with them, which means they will not have a standing military anymore, or a large military. They do have one only for defense. But prior to World War II, which a lot of people don't know, Japan had this expansion, and they took over most of the Pacific and Southeast Asian islands, which was definitely not something those islands wanted. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about the warfare, but they were not kind to the people who lived in those areas, despite their claims of United Pacific or Asia for Asians. So some of the things that we saw at this time period included the Vietnam War. What was the history of the Vietnam War? Well, all right, we had our colonial holdings in Southeast Asia. Japan steps in and invades them. Post-World War II, now Japan is gone, and what we see is the emergence then of communist groups. The communist groups, particularly in Vietnam, resisted the Japanese invasion, and they also wanted to get rid of the French, who were still partially there in Vietnam. So as a result of that, we have the emergence of Ho Chi Minh, right? So we might have heard of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He was a communist. He had actually spent some time in the USSR, which, if you're not thinking about that, is actually rather close to where we are. So he had observed the way that communist systems had worked in other areas, and he fights the French for a base in northern Vietnam, and he is actually successful. So the French lose. The United States has also stepped in at this point. They're trying to help. The French actually pull out, and this is what puts us into the Vietnam War with the French gone. So this makes this area formally become North and South Vietnam. So the north part of the country becomes communist, and the south is anti-communist, and it is allied to the United States. So the United States, as I said before, we were involved in this in the very beginning. We wanted to help our ally France. So we stepped in and tried to be involved in this battle between the communist forces in northern Vietnam and the French. Part of the reason why we do that is because of the fear of communism and the domino theory. So if you recall when we talked about the Cold War, United States does not like communism. It's one of our main things, right? So this is just before we had the time period of McCarthyism, a red under every bed, so all of those communist fears are what keep us involved in all of these situations. So we fear the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, all the other countries in the area will also fall to communism, just like dominoes. So this is why we involved ourselves in what becomes the Vietnam War. So in 1965, the United States sends 500,000 troops. So what were the results of the Vietnam War? Well, we were not successful. 58,000 Americans died as a result of our participation in the Vietnam War. On the other side of that, 1 million Vietnamese died, and that is both North and South Vietnamese. The United States at this time was widely criticized for our use of chemical agents, including Agent Orange and napalm. What is Agent Orange? Well, Agent Orange is a defoliant. So in your garden or around your house, you might use it as a herbicide. So you'd kill off plants, weeds. At the manufacturer's recommended dosage, probably not going to hurt you. It might hurt the plants, but not going to hurt human health. However, we were spraying it at doses of up to 30 times higher concentration than the manufacturer's recommended dose. Why were we doing that? So we were fighting with the Vietnamese in Vietnam, and this area is very heavily forested. So what that meant was we were fighting in an area of vegetation of which we were unfamiliar, and really high levels of trees and tree cover, and not really knowing where we were going. So we wanted to see the enemy. So we sprayed this defoliant to get rid of the vegetation. As you might imagine, that hurts the ecosystem. We're killing off birds, we're killing trees, we're killing any of the fish. This also led to hurting the health of our current and future generations. So Agent Orange is a bioaccumulator. That means that it builds up in the tissues of animals and humans. So the immediate effects, it would kill people. Obviously, you get skin rashes, burning skin, burning eyes, lung irritation. It does hang out in the nervous system, so people would have seizures. And then, if you were to survive being exposed to Agent Orange, it builds up in the tissues of your body. So for women who went on to have children after having been exposed to Agent Orange, the children were born with birth defects, as you see in the image. As I said before, the United States was widely criticized for our use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. So post-Vietnam War, we actually signed a chemical weapons treaty, which said that we would reduce any of our stockpile of chemical weapons, as well as any future development of chemical weapons. So for the most part, the United States at least stopped using chemical weapons as a result of our involvement in the Vietnam War. And as I said before, we also use napalm, which is pretty much the same thing, a defoliant, except that it is flammable, so you would burn down large swaths of the forest and also burn any people who were in the forest at the time. So again, very widely criticized for what we did during this war. So after the war, what happened? Well, in 1973, we left, right? We flew our last remaining troops out of Vietnam. And as I said before, we were not successful. We did not win. So in 1975, Vietnam becomes united under communist rule. Another lesser known war that was happening around the same time period as the Vietnam was the Khmer Rouge. So again, United States was heavily against communistic rule. So we were involved also in Cambodia. Pol Pot was another leader like Ho Chi Minh. He had observed communism around the world and decided, hey, that sounds great. Well, the Khmer overcomes the US government in Cambodia. They close the borders of Cambodia. And this is not to keep people from coming into Cambodia. This is to keep people from getting out. They institute policies that eventually lead to, as it says on the slide, the deaths of a quarter of the population of Cambodia in that 4-year time period. People were rationed food, oftentimes only a cup of rice per day. They were forced to work on farming collectives. And if they died, then they died. They died where they dropped. They did not care if they died or not. As it says on the slide, there became known these farming collectives called the killing fields, where millions of people were murdered. Anyone that was against the Khmer Rouge government, or anyone, again, who just died of starvation or overwork. Eventually, once Vietnam achieves independence from France and is also out of the Vietnam War with the United States, Vietnam helps Cambodia get independence from the Khmer Rouge, and that government is overthrown. This is not to be confused with the Khmer that we talk about if you've been to Cambodia or if you know anything about the history of the area, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the Khmer is an ancient civilization in Cambodia that built some lovely temples. Probably the most well-known is Angkor Wat. They are not related, just called the same thing, Khmer Rouge. So other post-World War II changes. After we see the removal of colonial holdings in this area, and it's after World War II, we see some miraculous growth in the economic systems of Southeast Asia. Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore become known as the Little Tigers. And we're going to talk about the Asian tigers of Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan next week when we talk about East Asia. But this is quote-unquote miraculous growth in the economy. So if you can see on our graph, this is our percentage of change from 1990 to 2010. And this is our gross domestic product. And so some countries like Singapore really seeing a huge spike in economic growth. Well, why? The reason why they call it miraculous is because it seemed to happen very rapidly, and economists were not understanding why that happened. Well, geographers studying these patterns realized that actually this was more a result of crony capitalism than it was of any other miraculous economic growth. So what was involved in crony capitalism? Well, crony capitalism is where the government or other officials in charge might give benefits to their friends or look the other way so that any kind of rules, like environmental rules, would not apply to their friends. Or if there was an illegal drug trade, they're also not paying attention to that. So this is in the textbook. And it's talking about the golden triangle of this area, which is the area where we see the production of opium and heroin. So this area has long been an area where we had the production of drugs. And we'll talk about the opium wars when we talk about China next week. So previously, as you can see, in the earlier days, Opium was created in China. It got exported out of the country, and especially the English really liked it. And then it gets processed into other types of drugs like morphine, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk about that more next week. But in the present, we still have heroin and opium trafficking. So this is where we see the green shaded area is an opium production area. And this is where we're growing poppies. So opium coming from the poppy flower. And before 1990, that was funneling into Thailand and then out to Hong Kong and out across the ocean to other drug dealing areas. But at the present, it's actually going up into China. And the reason is because in the past, China was communist, but China is no longer communist, is now considered state capitalist. So it's a little bit easier to move products on the landscape. And so now we can have a little bit easier movement of illegal drugs. Yay! All right, so let's talk a little bit about cultural identities and practices in Southeast Asia. So when we talked about South Asia, we mentioned that that area is patriarchal, meaning male-dominated. Southeast Asia is also male-dominated, so it is patriarchal. However, it is also matrilocal and not patrilocal. So in many other countries of the world, the new couple, when they get married, will move in with the husband's family. This is very common in China, for example. But in Southeast Asia, it's actually more common for the women or the new couple to move in with the women's family. This gives her a little bit more power than she might see in other parts of the world. Thailand in particular is also known for its polygyny, meaning that you could have multiple marriage partners. So overall then, these things give women a little bit more power here than they do in other world's regions. Because they live with the wife's family, she might have more protection. So if the husband abuses her, she's got her family around to protect her. She'll have more control over the family's finances. A lot of times the husband will work and then give the money to the wife. So the wife will control the money. Again, that gives her control over the destiny of the family. Women are also finding new employment in Southeast Asia. So which we'll talk about in just a little bit about our crony capitalism and all of that. But we see newly emerging industrialization inside of Southeast Asia. And these new industries are often employing women. Why? Well, women are more docile and easier to control, as well as you can pay them less. So while it's not really the greatest for women to get paid less and be treated badly, it is better than having no control at all. Where are they often employed now? In the service or manufacturing industries. But as I said, this area is still based on patriarchy or male dominance. Sometimes women's roles are not so good. So in Thailand, we have often a lot of sex workers. So Thailand is the world center for prostitution. This is often something called sex tourism, where males or women, but it's often men, will go to Thailand for the particular reason of getting a prostitute. It's considered a work bonus. We'll often see also human trafficking that's going through Thailand. So children get either sold by their families, which unfortunately, just because of the depressed economic status of most of the countries in Southeast Asia, they might have to do that. Or they're kidnapped and taken into trafficking and then passed along routes that are now on the internet. Sex work can be advertised on taxis and on billboards. So over time then we've seen the changes going from a colony to a area that's occupied by the Japanese. Post World War II, we see an economic boom. That's a result of crony capitalism and sometimes illegal drug trade. Our women's role, and now let's talk about religion. I mentioned this briefly before, but what are the dominant religions in this region? Our mainland or peninsular region is dominated by Buddhism. You don't need to know the different sects of Buddhism, just knowing that it's Buddhist primarily, as well as animistic religions, or as it says, traditional or shamanist religions, meaning belief that inanimate objects have a spirit, or also belief in ancestors. So ancestor worship, we'll talk about that more next week as well. In our insular or island region is predominantly Muslim. So if you didn't remember that from when we talked about the Silk Road and the movement of people and ideas and trade goods, remember Islam as a religion eventually diffuses all the way here to Southeast Asia. So there's actually a huge number of the population in Southeast Asia that are Islamic. Finally, in the Philippines, as I said before, predominantly Christian, especially Catholic. What about our languages? So as I said before, we can tell that the people of Southeast Asia are related to the people of Australia and the Pacific Islands, and this is through the tracking of language. So let's take a look. So in our upper right-hand side, in the mainland area, you can see that a lot of the languages are Austroasiatic. In our island area, it is mainly Austroasian. All right, so that is actually also related to the languages that we see moving out from the island or the insular region and into the Pacific Islands, as you can see in the lower left-hand map. So there's a fusion of that Austro-Indonesian, I'm sorry if I can't pronounce that correctly, language down into all of the Pacific Islands. What about religion? So as I said before, the dominant religion of our mainland or peninsular region in Southeast Asia is Buddhism. Buddha, remember, was born in the northeastern part of India, and eventually that religion diffuses into this area of the world where it is now dominant. Hinduism and Islam eventually spread as well. And as you can see in that lower left-hand map, we have the diffusion of Islam into Southeast Asia. So in the blue arrows indicating the movement of our religion and how is that occurring. So starting in Indonesia and making its way from Indonesia throughout the rest of the islands. So the landscape of Southeast Asia is a little bit different than the landscape that we see in other parts of the world. How is it different? Mainly because we see the representation of so many different religions. Because this area, while it was colonized by Europeans, in this area, the colonizers did not necessarily force the people of the region to abandon their own personal religion or their own personal language. So they were still allowed to have their own temples and have their own religion. So here's an example. Angkor Wat is a Hindu religion. We see numerous buildings dedicated to Hinduism throughout the landscape. We also see numerous Buddhist temples as well as Islamic temples. So these religions were allowed to flourish and express themselves throughout all of their colonized history. Again, different than other parts of the world where they were forced to practice the colonizers' religion. So as I said, Islam is mainly found in the islands, and there are more Muslims in Indonesia than there are in the Middle East. Again, that's a function of population density because there is such a high population density in Indonesia. Hinduism is not quite as common here as we saw in India, primarily found in Burma, Java, and Bali. So this is a Hindu temple in Bali. And Buddhism, as I said before, dominates the mainland region We also find other traditional religions, such as a mix of traditional religions with Buddhism. And here we can see this is a spirit house. So a lot of our quote unquote traditional religions have ancestor worship as a part of their religion. So they might build a little spirit house in which they give offerings to the ancestors or spirits who occupy our plants and our landscape and return for good fortune and good health. So Christian hill tribes are in Burma and Vietnam. This is a reflection of missionaries to the region. As I said before, Catholicism really struck the Philippines. As a matter of fact, 85% of the Philippines are Christian. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the current economic situation in Southeast Asia. We do see a lot of regional economic inequality. And what does that mean? Well, that means that the wealth is unevenly distributed across the landscape. For example, Singapore is really wealthy. Part of the reason why Singapore is so wealthy is because its position. And I'll point that out in the map in just a second, but it has dominated the shipping container industry in this region. So while Singapore is incredibly, and you can see that it is, it's also a city state, so it's easier for it to administer government. So they can maintain these things like keeping it clean and keeping it, well maintained, well governed. And then contrasting that to Cambodia, which is very poor. So part of the reason why we see some of that economic inequality within single countries is, just like we see in the United States, the wealth is concentrated in the hands of. How do we get that wealth? As I said before, crony capitalism. So our leaders in this area give benefits to their friends and their family, not like anything we've seen before, right? Nothing like anything else going on. But, if there's economic benefits to be had, like, maybe they have environmental impacts that they want to ignore or shipping routes that they want to control, the leaders will give that benefit to their friends and family. We also see, and again, this is why these areas become known as the little tigers, because of crony capitalism, but also because of kleptocracy, which is leaders are taking the nation's resources, their money, for their personal gain. So anything that might be diverted for example, social welfare, instead the leaders decide to use it for themselves. The results of these two actions, crony capitalism and kleptocracy, has also fed deforestation in this area. Again, this was an area that was very lush and covered with trees, and now most of those have been cut down. This is the most significant environmental problem in Southeast Asia. So why did we start deforestation? This actually begins in the colonial period because people want these special tropical hardwoods, particularly for furniture. So if any of you have ever been to like the Ethan Allen store and gotten Ethan Allen furniture, they tried to mimic this style of this time, which was, kind of Ernest Hemingway look to it, but it was with the tropical hardwoods. So things like sandalwood or teak or mahogany, these areas had a lot of those, and they're going to use it for their furniture. So they would cut down those trees in Southeast Asia and then send it back to the European colonies to make furniture. In the 1800s, this began widespread deforestation for rice production, but also the export, again, of those tropical hardwoods. And of course, we're not going to give any of the money to the indigenous people. Instead, it was under the European control. So the main reasons why we're doing that today, it continues for export agriculture. So unfortunately, a lot of the rice that's produced in this area is actually sent out of the country. Mangoes, which are, again, one of the staple crops of this region, and also the most widely consumed fruit in the world. You would think it was bananas, but no, it's actually mangoes. A lot of those mangoes also shipped out of the country. Too expensive for the people to eat because they're worth more as an export product. They continue cutting down the forest for the tropical hardwoods, also logging to produce paper, and then just people cutting down the forests to plant or to create new farms along the edge of the dense forest. So like I said, that problem has been made worse because of the crony capitalism, because they just kind of waived the environmental controls that other people might have had for their friends. So if you see on this map, what we're looking at is the land use land cover and areas that have been deforested. So deforestation has happened widely in the Philippines, across the Indonesia. In the water, we're seeing areas that were heavily overfished. In the red, you're seeing severely polluted ocean and waterways. So those are the polluted oceans. And all of that exacerbated by that crony capitalist situation. So what happens as a result of our deforestation? Well, obviously loss of species habitat. So one of our species that's most impacted is the orangutan. Orangutans are solitary animals. They are closely related to humans. There's a non-human primate, but they are solitary, so they don't mate very often. So when we see the loss of their habitat, that means that they will not mate because they don't have anywhere to go. So fewer and fewer orangutans are being born because they have no space for mating and living, and they'll just live by themselves. We also see impacts to the culture. So traditionally, people might have been, rice farmers, or as you saw on the previous slide, using elephants for labor, but they had a better relationship with the animals and the land in the past. Now, of course, because they make more money for export agriculture, like with the rice and the mangoes, they're mainly focused on that rather than preserving their own culture. Of course, we see environmental impacts as well. Flooding and soil erosion will happen when we don't have tree cover. So when you remove the soil, the tree cover, those roots are no longer able to hold onto the soil and we get erosion. Finally, we see a lot of pollution from burning. So if you see in the image on the left, when you burn the forest, and again, we're still practicing slash and burn here, or burning, to help recover soil fertility, but when you're doing excessive burning, a lot of particulate matter is going into the air. It is irritating to the lungs. It's releasing more carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So we see excessive amounts of pollution, and that's a cycle that is unfortunate because now we're burning down the trees that would have absorbed some of that carbon dioxide. One of the other problems we see in Southeast Asia is the removal of forests for palm oil plantations. Palm oil is a really controversial product because primarily where we see our palm oil estates or those farms is where we would see orangutan habitat. So when we cut down the forest for our palm oil plantations, now again, we're removing the place where orangutans can go. This was a big controversy a couple years ago with the Girl Scouts. People were pushing the Girl Scouts to produce cookies that were rainforest certified. After about a year or so, the Girl Scouts went ahead and did that. So now if you notice on the back of your Girl Scout cookies, it will say rainforest certified. And if you see that seal on other products, that is what it means, that the palm oil that was used in that product did not cut down the rainforest, so it did not remove habitat for our orangutans. The other type of plantation that we'll see in this area is rubber plantations. So we have naturally growing rubber trees in our rainforest areas of the world. Well, in the past, this is how we got rubber. It was the only way that we could get it. So if you were to look at the economic situation now, a lot of our auto manufacturers focus their factories, especially, of course, for production of tires in Southeast Asia, because they could tap the rubber trees. Well, again, that is harmful to the environment in a multitude of ways. So a lot of people have pushed for synthetic rubber, which we have produced. Still easier and cheaper to get the rubber from the trees, but trying to move away from that. So what are some of the conservation efforts to limit deforestation? Well, one of those is limiting raw timber export. This is actually useful in a lot of ways because, again, you get more economic benefit from producing products in your own country rather than exporting the raw material out of the country. And of course, that also limits the amount of raw timber that will be cut down, so we won't have large swaths of the forest being cut down for logging and other reasons. Also put in place protected areas like our parks. A lot of people don't actually realize that the parks that we have in the United States are pretty rare. A lot of countries don't have areas like that. This is why one of our major attractions cited by other countries is actually our state parks and our federal parks. So in parts of Southeast Asia, they have also put in place protected areas like our parks in order to protect the forest. Another way that people are working on protecting the forests is our Buddhist monks. So our Buddhist monks will go out into the forest and wrap trees with saffron cloth, so like yellow or orange cloth, and ordaining them as a Buddhist monk, which then puts in place a religious taboo that would say, okay, we're not going to harm monks. So now they won't cut down the trees because they are a Buddhist monk. They might also do that in the cityscape. So some of the things I said in words, the car industry, palm oil, this has happened in the highlands. It's continuing to go on today. It's not something that has changed necessarily, but there's been a lot of efforts to stop that. Okay, so that is Southeast Asia. Now you can go to Canvas and complete your quiz for this week.